There is a number the government releases every single month that determines how much your social security check grows, whether your wage raise actually means anything, how the Federal Reserve decides interest rate policy, and whether economists declare that everything is fine. It is called the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, and it is supposed to measure inflation. It is supposed to tell you how much more expensive life is getting. And every time it comes out, financial media runs the number across the ticker like it is gospel. Here is the problem: it is not accurate, and not in a rounding error kind of way. The methodology has been quietly changed 17 times since 1980, and every single change made the number go lower kind of way. So today we are going to do something the financial media does not bother doing. We are going to open the hood, look at what CPI actually measures, what it deliberately excludes, and why the inflation you feel every single time you swipe your card is very real, very painful, and almost entirely absent from the headline number everyone keeps quoting. So let's start with what CPI is supposed to do. The Consumer Price Index is calculated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Every month, they send out a team of people to track the prices of a basket of goods and services, things like groceries, housing, gas, medical care, clothing. The idea is simple: track what a typical American household spends money on, watch how those prices change, and report the result. Clean, straightforward, honest. Except it stopped being any of those things a long time ago, because here is where it gets interesting. The BLS does not just track prices, it adjusts them. And the adjustments it makes are the kinds of things that once you understand them, you cannot unsee. The first adjustment is called hedonic quality adjustment. And it sounds like a spa treatment, but it is actually an accounting trick. The idea is that if a product gets better over time, the BLS can lower its measured price even if the actual price you pay goes up. The classic example is computers. In 1997, you could buy a desktop computer for around $2,000. Today, you can buy one for $800 that is 100 times more powerful. So according to the BLS, computers are massively deflationary and they drag overall inflation down. Fine. That logic, while questionable, at least has some internal consistency. But here's the gut punch. They apply this same logic to cars, to televisions, to smartphones, to medical equipment. The result is that the BLS can look at a car that costs $15,000 more than it did 10 years ago, declare that the car is also significantly better, and then report that the effective price of that car has barely moved. You paid $15,000 more, the government recorded almost nothing, and your real cost of living just got erased from the data. The second manipulation is called substitution bias, and this one is almost elegant in how cynical it is. The original CPI methodology tracked a fixed basket of goods, meaning if steak was in the basket, steak got tracked. But starting in the 1990s, the BLS shifted to a model that assumes when one product gets too expensive, consumers substitute it for something cheaper. So if steak prices rise, the model assumes you will switch to chicken, and it starts tracking chicken. Which means the moment inflation forces you to downgrade your lifestyle, the CPI quietly adjusts to reflect your downgraded lifestyle instead of the original one. Inflation does not disappear. Your standard of living just gets redefined downward and the math stays clean. The third adjustment is owner's equivalent rent. And this one might be the most abstract, but it has an enormous impact on the number. Housing is roughly a third of the entire CPI calculation. But the BLS does not track home prices to measure housing inflation. Instead, it asks homeowners a survey question, essentially, how much do you think you could rent your house for? That is it. That is the number they use. And because this is based on a survey of existing homeowners rather than actual market transactions, it lags realities by anywhere from 12 to 18 months. So when the housing market absolutely exploded between 2020 and 2023, with home prices rising over 40% in some markets, the owner's equivalent rent metric barely flinched. It just kept slowly grinding upward while real rents were up 20 to 30% year over year in cities like Austin, Phoenix, and Miami. The data looked calm. Your rent check told a completely different story. Now, put all three of these methodologies together. Hedonic adjustments that lower prices on paper while you pay more at the register. Substitution bias that redefines the basket the moment it gets expensive. And a housing component that is structurally designed to miss the actual housing market. And you start to understand why the official number and your lived experience never seem to match. And here is the part nobody wants to say out loud. This is not an accident. Every percentage point that CPI drops saves the federal government an enormous amount of money. Social security benefits are indexed to CPI, federal pension payments are indexed to CPI, inflation-adjusted treasury bonds are indexed to CPI. The Congressional Budget Office once estimated that a single 1 percentage point reduction in measured CPI would reduce federal spending by around $1 trillion over 10 years. So when the government changes how CPI is calculated and the number conveniently drops, the incentives are not hard to follow. Lower inflation means lower cost of living adjustments. Lower cost of living adjustments means smaller checks to retirees, veterans, and federal workers, which means the government saves money while real prices keep going up and the people on the receiving end quietly lose purchasing power. 1. Methodological tweak at a time. Meet Karen. Karen is 68 years old, retired, and has been receiving Social Security for 3 years. Her annual cost of living adjustment in 2024 was 3.2% based on CPI, but Karen buys groceries. She goes to the doctor. She pays rent in a market where rents have gone up far more than 3.2% a year for the past 4 years. In theory, she got a raise. In practice, she fell further behind every single month. And here is the thing about Karen's situation. She is not an edge case. There are 71 million Americans receiving Social Security, and virtually all of them are dealing with the same math. The economist John Williams has been running an alternative inflation calculation called shadow stats for years. His methodology uses the pre-1980 CPI formula before the major revisions were made, and by that measure, inflation never really went away. In fact, by the older methodology, inflation during the 2021 to 2023 period was not 9%, it was closer to 15 to 17%. Now you can debate the exact numbers. You can argue that some of the BLS adjustments are legitimate attempts to measure reality more accurately. But at some point, the gap between what the formula says and what people are actually experiencing becomes impossible to explain away as a measurement refinement, because the data is everywhere if you bother to look. The cost of buying a home relative to median household income is at the highest level ever recorded. College tuition is up over 180% since 1980 after adjusting for official inflation. Health insurance premiums have risen roughly 50% in the last decade alone. Childcare costs in major cities now run anywhere from $15,000 to $35,000 per year per child. These are not niche expenses. These are the core costs of living a normal middle-class life in America. And they are all either excluded from CPI, smoothed out by hedonic adjustments, or buried under substitution assumptions that presume you will just find a cheaper option. And this is where it stops being just a statistics debate and starts being a real economic consequence. Because CPI does not just affect government checks, it affects every wage negotiation in the country. If workers are told inflation is running at 3%, they negotiate for a 3.5% raise and feel good about it. But if real inflation is running at 7 or 8% by any honest measure, that same 3.5% raise is actually a 3.5% pay cut, quietly, politely, with a press release that says inflation is under control. So what do you actually do with this information? A few things. First, stop using CPI as your personal inflation benchmark. Your inflation rate depends on what you actually spend money on. If you are a renter in a major city, your inflation rate for the last 4 years has been significantly higher than any headline CPI number. Track your own spending, know your own number. Second, if you are negotiating a raise, do not anchor to CPI. Anchor to what your actual expenses have done. Bring receipts, literally your grocery bills, your rent increases, your insurance premiums. That is your inflation rate, not theirs. Third, be skeptical of any investment return that does not beat 6 to 8%. Because if real inflation is running meaningfully above official CPI, then a savings account earning 4% or a bond portfolio returning 5% is not building wealth. It is losing ground slowly enough that you do not notice until you do. Fourth, understand that this problem compounds. Every year that your wages are anchored to an understated inflation figure, you fall further behind. It is not dramatic. It will not show up as a crisis. It will show up as the vague feeling that you are working harder but never quite getting ahead, which for most Americans is not a feeling. It is an accurate observation, and that is maybe the most uncomfortable part of this entire story. Nobody is going to come out and say the number is wrong. The BLS will keep publishing it. The Fed will keep citing it. The financial media will keep running it across the ticker. And the gap between official inflation and your actual cost of living will keep quietly widening, not because of some dramatic conspiracy, but because the incentives to keep the number low are massive. The methodology changes happen gradually, and nobody is forcing a direct comparison between what the formula says and what is actually in your bank account. So the next time CPI comes in at 2.9% and everyone on financial television nods their heads and says inflation is basically defeated, just remember that the formula measuring it has been revised 17 times in the direction of lower, that the number excludes or adjusts away most of the things that have actually gotten expensive, and that the people who benefit most from a low CPI reading are the same ones responsible for calculating it. History does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And the last time a government told its citizens inflation was under control, while their purchasing power eroded quietly in the background, the citizens eventually figured it out. They just usually figured it out about a decade too late. Drop your take in the comments because I am genuinely curious where you land on this. Do you think CPI is option A, a flawed but honest attempt to measure something genuinely complicated? Option B, a number that has been deliberately engineered to read lower for political and fiscal reasons? Or option C, that it does not actually matter either way, because the people making decisions based on it are too far removed from real life to care? Let me know below, because this is one where I do not think the answer is obvious and I want to see how split everyone actually is.